Hello, Tommy Fagan here. Welcome to the golden ages of Irish traditional music, your trusted guide through the rich tapestry of Irish traditional music recordings from the early 1900s. Each podcast will explore the legendary musicians, landmark recordings, and distinctive styles that have shaped this vibrant tradition. Guest experts will discuss their selection of recordings covering the golden ages of the Roaring Twenties, post-war London, the Ceilidh Band era, the Super 70s, the digital generation, and the traveller tradition. If you're a seasoned player, an avid listener, or just beginning, prepare to embark on this engaging journey through time and tunes. And this week I'm delighted to introduce Peter Woods, a well-known writer and broadcaster, and whose specialism is Irish traditional music in and around London in the 60s and 70s. Peter, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Tommy.
Thank you for helping us with this, and I look forward to hearing of your experiences. But before we get into the interview in depth, Peter, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and then how you ended up in London?
I'm from this place called Stunnan in Monaghan. I was born in London, and my family moved back to Ireland in the 60s. In the mid-60s from London. In my family growing up, like, there was traditional music because my father could play a bit on the accordion, and his brother would have been a noted fiddle player, but he had multiple sclerosis by the time we were growing up. So he wasn't playing anymore. And it was kind of at an era when it was I would say the end nearly of a type of traditional music that had been played in that South Monaghan area. So there was music in our house at least once a month. There's a fiddle player called P.G. Courtney who lived up at the bungalow in Donaghmine, and Tommy English, who'd been in America for a while. He was from the Maracloon side, and he was a fiddle player as well. So there was a bit of music around the house. And they'd have talked about growing up because my grandfather's house in Broomfield, they had a loft there, and they used to have dances in the loft. And my grandfather apparently had medals for step dancing, and they tell me that the dances that they would have danced then are nearly lost now as well. But that was sort of in sort of 77. I went to London. I finished my Leaving Cert and I went to London near enough the same day, and didn't come back basically, at least to live here for 18 years. I came back in 95.
And when you went over, did you encounter the Irish music scene immediately, or did you have to seek it out?
You know, had to look for it, because it's funny enough now, I was living out, I had a job in a pub out in Hayes in Middlesex, and you'd hear fellas talking, which became the music you'd have heard would have been the music you'd have heard probably in Irish pubs around there and in Catholic clubs, and that was kind of, you know, the show band style of music, or, you know, songs about like the boys of the County Armagh, or that.
Good choice.
Yeah, or this Pretty Little Girl from Omagh, those type of songs. Yeah. And you heard people occasionally talking about traditional music. There was a pub in Southall, which wasn't far from there. There was a box player who was supposed to have owned that, called Coyne. And there would have been fellas in and out that I got to know in and out of the pub. East Galway men who'd have had big, you know, Joe Burke, Joe Cooley, that style of interest in music. But before I went to London, I was an avid listener to the Long Note. And you probably know, like, when I was growing up, around my age group, there weren't many people interested in traditional music. It was kind of Top of the Pops, or it was the show bands and that. And the Long Note became a sort of a thing that you realize that there were other people like you in the country, and you started to hear about it. And I had heard a Long Note program from London, and they were talking about this place called the White Hart on Fulham Broadway. So I went looking for the White Hart on Fulham Broadway.
Good, I'm glad you did. What was it like the very first night that you walked into a session?
Yeah, you'd have gone down like the White Hart, and you come out of the tube station. So I walk out of the tube station and you cross the road. You could see the pub across the road. And I was with the fella from who was turned out to be a very good friend of mine, Kevin Flaherty. He was from Inisheer. And the two of us got there so early that we were so excited about music. We got there so early that we had to go away again because there was no music on. So we went away, had something to eat, and came back. And you the bar at the front, there was a public bar at the front, and a kind of a lounge bar at the back, and you had to walk down a long corridor to get to the lounge bar. And anybody who ever did that walk would tell you, we were walk down that corridor, and you could hear the music coming up and wafting up it. And it was the first night I went in there. It was Liam Farrell, Raymond Rowland, and Roger Sherlock. And
Oh,
they're probably as good a trio as still, I would say, as good a
yep.
trio as I have heard. Liam was from Oma, and Roger was from the sort of arguably the Sligo Mayo borderlands, and Raymond was the Crofkwell in East Galway's brilliant box player. They were all great musicians,
And
and you walked in. And funny enough, it was a very London thing in lots of places. There was a stage, but you wouldn't really call it. It was maybe a foot off the ground. It was a little bit raised, and musicians would play on that. Kevin Taylor often backed them. Paddy Taylor's son, he did who was a very good musician, great and a lovely fella himself. He would have backed them a lot of the time on the piano. But in those sessions when people were playing, if a musician came up, the custom was if a musician came in, the musician wouldn't join that session. The musician might be invited to come up and play, and the three boys or a version of them might head off and have a couple of pints at the bar and let somebody else entertain for a while. And occasionally the musician might join in.
what year was that?
That was 77, 78.
At that time back in Ireland, you're probably aware that there weren't many pub sessions underway
No,
at that stage.
no. The only pub session I just said that I had been in any way regularly was what happened in Marks in Dundalk, because
Hmm.
I'd worked for the Simon community for a couple of months in Dundalk, and I was kind of in and out of there. I think it was John Joe Gardner was still around that time. But it wasn't the same. Like the pub session comes from London because fellas had been going home from work. Like I take a case in point, which is kind of an exception. Say Lucy Farr was a great fiddle player. Lucy
Hmm.
Farr was from the Ballinakill side of East Galway, and she'd be one of the original origins of nearly East Galway music. Still, she was a brilliant player. But Lucy went over to England, and she trained as a nurse, and for years she didn't play because she was living in a nurse's home when she was doing her training, and she wouldn't have been allowed to play there. And you'd have had lots of fellas who played music, but they might be in lodgings, and they wouldn't have a place to play music where they were. So that's why they started going to the pubs. They say that it started off in the pub in Kentish Town called the Devonshire Arms after the war,
Hmm.
and it was the Sligo musicians who started it off. It was a crowd of fellas from around Gurcheen, Tubbercurry, that side of Sligo. Probably, I think John Veazey was in London then. I think Martin Wynne was in London then before they went to American. And certainly Michael Gorman was in that setup as well. And that's credited, whether it's true or not, has been the first session. And the music sessions and pubs was a very London thing. And in other British cities as well, obviously, but fundamentally a London thing.
Could you put a date on that earlier origins of the session that
Well,
you've
they say that
described?
immediately 1946 is what they talk about in the Devonshire Arms. I think that probably the fella, in an awful lot of cases, they used to always talk about whoever was the landlord in the Devonshire Arms that time. I think he was from that part of Sligo, so he had
Mhm.
the interest in the music. But you'd have been like lots of pubs. The landlord wouldn't, or the person who was running the pub mightn't be interested in music at all.
Right.
There was they used to say, I never met the man, but they used to say that the best landlord that was ever in the, or not that I never met, I did meet him. The best landlord that was ever in the White Hart was from Monaghan. And by accident, I went into a pub on Fulham Road. Uh, 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 few years after, and I got talking to the fella behind the bar, and it turned out he'd run the White Hart. And I said, "Do you know that they think that you were the best man the best man that was ever in there for music?" And he said, "I hated it." He said, "I just kept away from them."
Well, he did the right thing, maybe.
Yeah,
He allowed it to flourish.
he did. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
But Peter, back to the White Hart. Did you discover that there were other pubs then after that?
There were other pubs, but that was like there was the Sugon Kitchen. There was a lot of pubs on the Holloway Road that you'd hear about, and there'd be occasional sessions in pubs. Like I remember, I think it was the Greyhound, which would be again round the Hammersmith side of Fulham, and going in there I was told there was music there. It didn't last long, but going in there on the Sunday morning, I think that might have been the first time I seen Brian Rooney playing. A pub, the White Hart in Acton, that Sean O'Shea used to play. And Sean O'Shea is another one. Sean was born in London. His father was from Kerry, and his mother, actually, as a ghost, was from Lara in Monaghan. And he was evacuated to Monaghan during the Second World War. Came back to London. He was a champion athlete. I believe he's very good at karate as well, and a fiddle player. Very influenced by Sean Maguire, joined the Police, but kept the music going. And he's still alive. But as far as I know, he's still alive. He was featured very prominently on Paddy and the Smoke.
Well, many thanks to Peter there for a brilliant expose on Irish traditional music in the London scene in the years after the war. We'll be returning to Peter for future episodes and more great music. Now, before we go, as usual, I'm going to refer you to one of the jokes from my recently published Cobblestone book of Irish traditional music jokes. Two Baron players, Tommy and Desi, are walking along in a park one day. Suddenly, Desi notices a dead bird. "Ah, look at the wee dead birdie," he says. Tommy stops, looks up into the sky and says, Where? Thanks for listening. Mind the dresser and slán go fóill.
Thank you.